The United States says its sanctions on Iran have been crippling the country's economy. But the government of Iran doesn't seem fazed by them. Is time running out on the West's showdown with Iran? I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Iran is celebrating the 34th anniversary of its Islamic Revolution this week. In his speech marking the occasion, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad said the Islamic Republic, quote, will not back down on its fundamental rights, even a single iota, in the face of pressure from Western nations to halt its nuclear program. Western powers have accused Iran of developing nuclear weapons for decades. Iran has systematically denied these allegations, claiming that its nuclear program is solely for peaceful purposes. Iran has endured international sanctions for nearly 3 decades, but the Iranian government continues to insist that the restrictions haven't harmed the economy. The latest round of U.S. sanctions were signed into law by President Obama in August of 2012, and provisions that ban Iran from repatriating any profits from its oil sales abroad went into effect last week. Under these new sanctions, Iranian oil profits must be deposited to bank accounts in the countries that buy Iranian oil. Then the money can only be used by Tehran to purchase and import goods from those countries. The data suggests that this round of sanctions is causing Iran's economy to falter. Iran's oil exports have fallen by 1 million barrels a day in the last year following international embargoes. That has resulted in a loss of 60% of the country's oil revenues. The Iranian currency has lost 40% of its value against the U.S. dollar since last summer, driving inflation in Iran up by more than 25%, the highest in decades. A new round of international talks on Iran's nuclear program are scheduled for later this month. But U.S. Vice President Joe Biden said last week that the United States is willing to negotiate directly with the Iranian government if officials in Tehran show a serious commitment to abandoning their pursuit of a nuclear weapon.
There is still time, there is still space for diplomacy, backed by pressure, to succeed. The ball is in the government of Iran's court. We would be prepared to meet bilaterally with the Iranian leadership. We would not make it a secret that we were doing that. We would let our partners know if that occasion presented itself. That offer stands.
But Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has ruled out any prospect of bilateral negotiations with the United States, saying that such talks would be naive.
Negotiations are meaningful when the two sides negotiate with good intentions and without planning to deceive one another. Negotiations should be on equal terms. Negotiations for the sake of negotiations and the offer of negotiations as a superpower gesture are deceptive moves. You want to point the gun at the people of Iran and say, negotiate or we will shoot. You say these things to intimidate the Iranian nation. You should know that the Iranian nation is not intimidated by these things.
So if negotiations are out of the question for now, what's next in the West standoff with the government of Iran? Joining me now is Iranian-American journalist Houman Majd. He is also the author of the book, The Ayatollah Begs to Differ, The Paradox of Modern Iran. Houman, thanks so much for joining us here on The Heat. Let me start with another paradox, these competing narratives about Iran. One is this is a country that's has crippling sanctions. It's really having an impact on this country. And yet there's this other narrative, which is that, you know, Iran's kind of this regional power and involved with tentacles everywhere, sort of like an octopus. It's in Lebanon, it's in Iraq, Afghanistan. This week in the Washington Post, a story about a militia 50,000 strong in Syria. And it doesn't seem like these two narratives can square. How can a country just reeling from sanctions be this active? So try and explain that to us if you can.
Well, I think both narratives have there's some accuracy to both narratives, but not entirely, obviously. I think the idea of Iran being this regional superpower is exaggerated. I think it is a power, certainly, and is powerful, and has a very strong military, and has influence in countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, for sure. But I don't think it's a superpower in the sense that it could really inflict any serious damage to any of its neighboring countries, nor has it ever shown any intent to do so. In terms of the crippling sanctions, well, certainly, yes, they are they hurt the Iranian economy, but they're not really hurting the government. They're not really hurting the establishment as much as they're hurting ordinary people, which is the unfortunate byproduct of sanctions generally. It's true everywhere. So are they crippling the Iranian economy? I wouldn't say they're crippling it. They might be crippling some businesses. It might be crippling some people who can't get access to medicine and various other imported goods. And inflation is hurting a lot of Iranians, but inflation doesn't really hurt the government. And the sanctions don't really hurt the government, and Iran's still a very wealthy country. So there's accuracy in both of those narratives, but they're both exaggerated, I think, in terms of their net effect. Sanctions certainly aren't going to. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, what about the ordinary people on the streets? I mean, you mentioned it briefly there. Is there a sense of outrage? Does this almost benefit the Iranian government in a sense that there's an anger towards the West, or how is it playing out?
Well, there was a recent poll that was published last week that said, the Gallup poll that showed that the Iranians are blaming the U.S. and the West for sanctions rather than their own government. And if you remember a year ago, as sanctions were being tightened on Iran, I believe it was Hillary Clinton who said a number of times that the wish was that the Iranians would blame their own government and not the U.S. for imposing these sanctions. But I think that's not an unusual thing. I think people tend to blame the person imposing the sanctions and not their own government for attracting those sanctions, particularly as they don't really see the sanctions as something that their government has invited necessarily by any serious action on the part of their government. In terms of the nuclear issue, I mean, there's a lot of discontent in Iran, certainly, and there's discontent with the regime. But in terms of the nuclear issue, it tends to still be a relatively popular program.
Well, if it doesn't have this paralyzing effect on the country, and it doesn't look like direct talks are on the table, does that mean that the United States has to step a little closer to a military decision, do you think?
I don't think so. I would hope not, certainly. I don't think that there is a military solution to the nuclear issue. Even talk of a military solution, I think, is unhelpful at this point. First of all, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon now, according to U.S. intelligence and every intelligence agency in the world. Hasn't shown an indication that it is going to build one or is trying to build one at this time. So we're years off from a testable, workable nuclear and deliverable nuclear weapons. So the idea of military action anytime soon seems preposterous to me, and would only help the regime in Iran actually, and would hurt civil society as the sanctions have done, and has this pressure from the United States and from Western nations towards Iran. So I think the only solution is negotiations.
Analysts have predicted that the upcoming presidential election, and I'm going to do it in quotes, they say that this has the potential to be the most rigged election in the history of the Islamic Republic, which may be saying something, I guess. What are your thoughts about the upcoming election? Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, I think, it depends on what you consider rigged, because a lot of people consider the process rigged because the Guardian Council eliminates any candidate that they don't believe is worthy of the job or is capable of the job, or they just disqualify hundreds of candidates. On the other hand, presidential elections are hotly contested in Iran, and there's usually an arch conservative, there's usually a moderate conservative, and there's usually a reformist in the running, someone who's much more liberal. I think it's likely that there will be the same situation this time. I guess the reformist side will be potentially less represented this time. It'll have to be someone who's a very conservative reformist who's allowed to run.
We're just about out of time. I just want to ask one final question, and if you can be brief, that'd be terrific. There was this popular uprising in 2009, and yet it stalled. It was squashed. We've seen the Arab Spring. Many people think that this was actually the precursor to all of that. Why do you think it didn't succeed, and are we likely to see the same sort of outcome with this election, do you think?
I don't think we're likely to see it with this election. I think there's a great deal of apathy among the Iranian population. I think it didn't succeed because the goals weren't very clear. The goals in the Arab Spring were very clear. They wanted to overthrow regimes that were in power. In Iran, the Green Movement's goal wasn't to overthrow the regime. It was a protest against a vote. There were some elements in that protest that were against the regime and would like to see the regime go. But generally speaking, the Iranian people as a whole at that point in 2009 were not looking to overthrow the regime. And I think that was a significant difference. And the regime still had a great deal of support, and probably still does have quite a bit of support among the people. Perhaps not as much as it had in the past, but it still has quite a bit of support, whereas in the Arab Spring, the regimes really didn't have very much support at all. But I don't think that'll happen again this time. I think they'll be very cautious to not let it happen, but also I think there isn't really a green movement around anymore to protest a vote.
Hooman, thank you so much for providing this analysis. Certainly a pleasure talking to you. Thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Coming up next, my conversation with one of Iran's leading opposition voices. Stay with us.
In a business world of information overload, we strip away the complexity and confusion to give you the essence of financial news. Pure value. Biz Asia America.
In his State of the Union speech earlier this week, President Barack Obama once again warned the government of Iran that the West will not tolerate Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon.
The leaders of Iran must recognize that now is the time for a diplomatic solution, because a coalition stands united in demanding that they meet their obligations, and we will do what is necessary to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon.
But Iran remains defiant, and just hours after President Obama's speech, Iranian officials announced the installation of new centrifuges for enriching high-grade uranium at the country's main nuclear facility. So much for ultimatums from U.S. presidents. So is a nuclear-armed Iran unavoidable? What options are left for the U.S. and its European allies? Joining me now to offer his insights is Prince Reza Pahlavi. He's the son of Iran's last Shah, the late Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And he is also one of the most prominent voices of the Iranian opposition. Prince Reza, thank you for coming in and joining us here on The Heat. We just heard President Obama. I want to get your reaction to that, but something that was kind of a little different. Normally when there's a statement by the President of the United States in a State of the Union address like this, it's followed by a pledge to support the Iranian people in gaining freedom and democracy in the country. We didn't hear that in this speech this week. Does this signal a shift in the U.S. and its policy towards Iran, do you think? Are we reading too much into this, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I've always maintained that what happened 34 years ago in Iran was the coming to power of a bunch of people with a particular ideology, which had nothing to do with the deep desires of Iranians and what Iran is all about. When I hear various heads of states, including American presidents, refer to Iran as a threat, I would first of all propose that they rephrase and say the regime is a threat. Iran has never been a threat. In fact, Iran has always been a peace-loving country and contributing to the world community from centuries ago. Attempting to find a reasonable entente in a sort of coexistence with this regime is futile. Let me tell you why. The essence and existence and purpose of this regime is to export a religious ideology. And for them to survive in this ideology is to defeat the West and everything it stands for. All the values that we recognize in the world today, in the free world, democracy, human rights, and so on and so forth, is poison to this regime. They cannot coexist. Their aim is to destroy the West. And if they do it, and the more means they have to be able to impose their hegemony, they will. That's in fact why they need the nuclear issue, for them to survive. It's almost like asking this regime not to breathe anymore. They need that. It's part of their entire game plan. So insisting on diplomacy is a waste of time.
You say nothing has changed. Would you say that about the United States' policy too? I mean, it seems as though sanctions seem to be the effort the United States takes to apply pressure. Over time, it doesn't look as though they've worked. If President Obama were to say, Prince, give me some advice, what might it be?
Well, my first word, not just to the United States government, but to many foreign governments that have been part of this package of economic sanctions to bring pressure on Iran, is that the entire premise, again, is faulty. The whole purpose of imposing sanctions was not to cause regime change in Iran, but behavior change by the regime. Again, it ties back to my previous comment. You expect a reasonable behavior by this regime. They won't. Therefore, the only impact that the sanction has had, ultimately, if it's only with the objective of forcing the regime to change its behavior, which it won't, is ultimately going to hurt the people.
You've expressed some disappointment in President Obama, and then there are critics who say that his policy towards Iran is too hawkish. How would you, and you're shaking your head no, it's not hawkish enough?
Well, look, first of all, let's understand what we mean by pressure or hawkishness. Hawkishness doesn't necessarily mean being a warmonger. But soft diplomacy has not worked either. President Obama, just to prove that he's different from G.W. Bush, particularly at the outcome of 9/11 and what happened in Afghanistan and what happened in Iraq, was to say, well, I'm not him, and I'm sending a message, America is not at war with Islam, and so on and so forth, and his whole world tour within the Muslim communities, and engagement with the Iranian regime. Well, let's rewind tape to 4 years ago. And let's not forget what happened in 2009 with the election fiasco. Again, if you follow the same rationale that I just explained, it is the same old policy of trying the same matter of approach again. The name of the administration has changed, but the policy apparently still is the same. And if I recall correctly, Albert Einstein once said that thinking that by doing more of the same you can achieve a different outcome is a sheer sense of insanity. We're doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome.
You mentioned us as Iranians. Obviously, you feel a kinship to the people in Iran, and you'd love to see regime change. What's going to be the tipping point, do you think? What would cause that?
Well, look, as the clock is ticking, diplomacy has failed. We cannot jump directly from failed diplomacy to war and striking Iran militarily, whether it's an Israeli initiative or whoever else's initiative, because that's lose-lose. It's not going to solve the problem. There's a better way and a much less costly and far more legitimate way to bring about change. That is to bring the change at the hand of the Iranian people by helping them directly to foment a movement that can ultimately force the regime to paralysis and collapse, by means of nonviolent civil disobedience, but carefully orchestrated, packaged, led, and supported by the international community. You do the math. It's going to cost much less. It will not be a scenario of conflict and war. It will not be a threat to the regional stability. And the outcome, most importantly, will resolve in one shot several problems. The problems you have with proliferation, the problem you have with terrorism and radicalism, the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and many other issues that ultimately could bring our region to real stability. But the will has to be there. So I think if that decision, which is yet to be made, is made in time, we can in fact avoid a scenario of conflict. But that window is tight. Therefore, action needs to be taken now.
You and I had a chance to talk briefly before this interview, and I asked you about the election. You said, what election? You don't really hold it in high regard, but do you have any predictions or thoughts about it?
Well, it would be insulting to call this mockery of a process an election, in the sense that you talk about elections in any democratic country. And as such, it has always been the regime fronting a pre-screened candidate and trying to play with people's heads and survive just a bit longer. But nobody is taking the system seriously or legitimately. What the people are really frustrated with is that when they cannot overcome this regime easily as a result of its severe repression, they don't see, on the other hand, any real support for change. They hear a lot of lip service. They hear a lot of claims about we support the Iranian people in, or we support the Iranian people that, coming from the mouth of an American president or some other world leader. But in reality, You continue negotiating with this regime and its representatives only, and there's no real dialogue or support for the real forces of the country that are democratic, that are peace-loving, and represent the great majority of the Iranian nation.
You know, when I look at you, you can see a little bit of your father in you. Obviously, there's a striking resemblance. You were a teenager when he fell from power. If there was a way to turn back the clock and go back in time and give him some advice, knowing what you know now, what might you have said to your dad about his leadership or his style, or do you think there's anything that could have been done to change history?
You know, should have, could have, would have. I don't think that way. I'm the kind of person who moves forward. I don't get stuck with what happened. I may want to analyze it. I may want to question to see why something happened the way it happened, but I'm not stuck in it. I think the objective should be, now what? Where are we now? Where do we want to go? It basically means foresight. When you look at the founding fathers that were the basis upon which America became the country that it is today, at the time, you could have imagined that now that you think of it, you say, oh my God, they really thought it through. There was really a lot of anticipation, a lot of foresight. Well, again, this foresight should be the result of having learned from something. Old Europe and the lessons drawn from there led to all the ideology or philosophy that led to the Declaration of Independence, that led to the articles that formed this country. Now, each country may have its own sets of history and references, but it's always this objective of moving forward that should be key. Learn from the past and move forward. That, I think, is the most obvious lesson. And today, in this world of communication, you can reach millions of people instantaneously, as opposed to what it was 200 years ago or even 50 years ago in Iran.
Well, speaking of moving forward, unfortunately we have to. Prince Reza, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your program.
When we come back, The View from Tehran. That's coming up in just a few moments. Stay with us.
Culture Express. See the world in color.
A new Gallup poll released last week reports that 31% of Iranians rated their lives poorly enough to be considered suffering in 2012. And 56% of Iranians said that sanctions imposed by the West are hurting their livelihoods a great deal. Can the Iranian government withstand all this pressure and the sanctions from the West? Joining me now to offer his explanation from Tehran is Dr. Mohammad Marandi. He is an Iranian political analyst and associate professor at the University of Tehran. And we want to welcome you to the Heat. Thanks so much. Let me start with the Gallup poll, if we can. What are your thoughts on that? Are they accurate?
Yes, I think it's quite obvious that the vast majority of Iranians blame the United States and the EU for the hardships that have come about as a result of the sanctions. The United States and the Europeans have tried to shut down the Iranian central bank, thus and as a result they're trying to prevent Iran from carrying out any form of trade, and that even includes importing and exporting medicine and foodstuff. And as a result, for example, there have been some shortages of medicines and people have died. Of course, the government is trying to overcome the sanctions, and it is finding alternative routes for carrying out trade. But the attempt really is to hurt ordinary Iranians, to make people lose jobs, to make people suffer. And people in Iran see this as very uncivilized.
Well, you're talking about ordinary citizens. What kind of impact do you think it's having on the Iranian government? Obviously, the sanctions imposed to create some type of action on their part. Is it making them more compliant, do you think, or are they more likely to dig in their heels because of the sanctions? What's the overall reaction there from the government, would you say?
I don't think the sanctions are going to have any effect on Iranian policy. First of all, the sanctions are not nearly as effective as Western countries would like them to be, and the hurt is not as much as they would like to see. But in general, when you look at the polls and attitudes among ordinary Iranians, they believe that the nuclear program, first of all, is a right, and that Iran, within the framework of international law, has that right and should continue, therefore, with the nuclear program. And I think that the current administration and the political elite at large, they too believe the same thing. So it's not going to change Iranian policy. In fact, the only thing that I really think will happen is that Iran will begin to replace Europeans and North American countries as trading partners, and they will find other partners such as India, China, Brazil, South America. So in the long run, the Europeans and Americans lose a great deal. And also I think it hurts American and European standing in Iran and beyond, because people see these actions as quite inhuman, and it doesn't create sympathy for the United States or Obama.
Let me ask you about this. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, along with Germany, will meet with the Iranians in Kazakhstan, as you well know, February 26th for the latest series of talks about Iran's nuclear program. Well, given what you just said, can we expect much to come out of those talks?
At this stage, I don't think that much will come out of this. The Russians and the Chinese have parted ways with the United States and the Europeans. They've come to this recognition that Iran's nuclear program is completely peaceful. There are senior officials, and both countries have said this repeatedly, and so have intelligence officials. Also, I think that after Libya and after Western countries have tried to create civil war in Syria, Russia and China have become more cautious about American policy. So there are sharp divisions between the 5+1 member states. The Iranians are quite willing to move forward, but the Iranians believe that at the moment the United States and the Europeans are simply unwilling to behave reasonably and to try to find a solution. Their attempt is to sort of make Iran capitulate, and that is simply not going to happen.
Let me ask you about the upcoming elections. Analysts have predicted that it is going to be, as in quotes I'll say this, the most rigged election in the history of the Islamic Republic. Prince Reza Pahlavi said, "I wouldn't even call it an election, that would be a mockery." Give us your perspective.
Elections are very serious. They are competitive. The turnout has always been high. The reformists are going to participate. Allies of former President Rafsanjani will be participating. Allies of the current president will be participating, and I think other factions associated with the so-called principalists or the conservatives will also be participating. I think they'll be quite interesting elections. I have no idea who is going to win them at this stage, but Iran is very different from the sort of place that we often hear about in the Western media.
We've got about 20 seconds, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to speak to our international audience. What's it going to take? It just seems like we're at a loggerheads with the West and with Iran. What's it going to take to break that impasse?
I think that Western countries, and especially the United States, has to come to terms with the reality of Iran, that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not going to go anywhere. It is stable. It is much more stable than the other countries in the region. And the United States must come to terms with that, come to respect Iran. If it comes to that stage, then I think a solution is possible.
Dr. Mahrandi, thank you so much for joining us from Tehran. Certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on Twitter. You can tweet us your questions and comments at CCTV_The Heat. Once again, that's at CCTV_The Heat. And if you missed any of this show or to catch any of our programming online, you can always log on to CCTV-America.com. And remember, when the weekend rolls around again, don't forget to turn on the heat. Until then, I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time.